Good morning, AP Psychology students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I've got some notes here for Chapter 9, and we're going to talk a little bit about adolescence and human development. So as we go along, make sure that you have your packet or graphic organizer, and make sure that you are starting where it says changes that mark the transition into adolescence. So here we go. Adolescence in industrial societies is a developmental period beginning with puberty and ending at adulthood. Basically, this will probably differ between boys and girls depending on when puberty begins. Perhaps with girls maybe starting as young as age 11, with boys possibly about age 13. Rites of passage are social rituals that mark the transition between these developmental stages between childhood and adulthood. And these rituals probably vary a little bit from culture to culture, but they usually take place about the time of puberty, and they serve as a public acknowledgement of that transition between childhood and adulthood. Some of these rituals might be more religious when we talk about things like confirmation, or perhaps maybe within the Jewish culture, a bar or bat mitzvah. They could also be marking whether or not or how an individual is seen by maybe a community. And so when you get into cultures that are, like, let's say within tribal Africa, it may be the mark of whether or not a person has got the courage to actually be considered an adult. But if you're living in here in the United States, that is, the passage for middle-class teenagers typically is the driver's license. So, physical maturation in adolescence, puberty is usually basically referred to as the onset of sexual maturity. Primary sexual characteristics include maturity of sex organs or genitals. Secondary sex characteristics are gender-related physical features that develop during puberty. So for males, that could be things like facial hair or the deepening of their voice. For females, it could be the widening of their hips and the enlarging of their breast. Body image, one's personal and subjective, and what we mean by subjective is it's kind of like how you see yourself and how you, for the most part, kind of perceive yourself. Your view of your own appearance becomes really important. This may be based on one's weight, height, but it could also be your perceptions of other people's assessment and maybe even the cultural standards of what we kind of refer to as physical beauty, and that's going to vary from culture to culture. Cognitive development. A while back we talked a little bit about Jean Piaget and his stages of cognitive development, primarily in the little ones, talking about the sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, but we did not talk about the last stage, and that is formal operational, which starts somewhere around age 12. It's the fourth stage of development. This is when an individual begins to ponder introspective problems involving ways of becoming better accepted by peers, along with abstract thinking. And it's this kind of thought process that allows for an individual to kind of take on more difficult concepts when it comes to their education. So when we talk about in mathematics, perhaps maybe starting the beginning of algebra, perhaps, or algebraic operations within a math class. When we talk about formal operations, they use abstractions to adopt thinking strategies. There's concentration of the hormones, estrogen, and also testosterone, that rise to higher levels. The frontal lobe, which is involved in social and emotional behaviors, is undergoing kind of a remodel during this period of time. A while back we talked about synaptic pruning with our very young infants, but your frontal lobe kind of goes through a kind of a similar remodel situation, and those old circuits that are not being used kind of get pruned away to allow for new circuits to be established. Okay, there's also possibility a change in the balance of neurotransmitters, and this may open the door to other issues, particularly when we talk about deficits or situations where there's too much secretion of certain hormones or neurotransmitters that might be related perhaps to things like mental illness, such as depression and schizophrenia. So these are kind of important time periods when we talk about that. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about Erik Erikson. And a while back we talked a little bit about some of his different theories on social development. We're going to kind of focus on the theories that kind of focus on this transitional period from really being a child into teens and adulthood. So we're going to talk first of all about identity and role confusion. And depending on the individual, this could start as early as age 13 and last until age 21. It's during this period of time that adolescents are moving towards the emergence of their self-identity, how they see themselves, how they perceive themselves. Family ties become a little more stretched as our young people or adolescents are spending more time away from home. They encounter new values and receive less structure and adult guidance, and they may have a stronger need for peer acceptance. Teens may experience problems with loneliness, depression, and shyness. Biological changes with puberty, such as the rise in the different levels of testosterone in boys, has been associated with riskier antisocial behavior. Individuals may have conflicts with their parents and experience extremes in their moods. Only about 6% of our teens and young adults are at high risk for any kind of crime. Most of them are males, ranging from the age of 15 to 25. The single strongest correlation of delinquency is family structure. And about 2/3 of all delinquent males come from single-parent families involving mostly a woman leading that household. About 2/3 of teenage girls who have babies out of wedlock also come from single-parent homes with only a mother as the head of the household. Sexuality and adolescence. A little while back when we were in Chapter 8, we talked a little bit about sexual orientation and such. So this is going to be kind of a review, but sexual orientation is the sexual attraction that one has towards people, and sexual attraction of people of the same sex is known as homosexuality. If you were looking for statistics, and granted, some of these may vary because some people may not be reporting, but statistically, somewhere between 1 to 3.5% of the entire population might identify as being exclusively homosexual. Heterosexuality is the sexual attraction to people of the opposite sex. All right, to switch gears, we're going to talk a little bit about moral development and the theories of a man named Lawrence Kohlberg. Kohlberg did a little bit of research on how people make moral judgments or reasons, and he basically narrowed it down to basically 3 different stages with some sub-stages in between. The pre-conventional morality, the conventional morality, and the post-conventional morality. So as we go along, we're going to kind of talk a little bit about this, and probably after you get done doing your notes today, you got a little activity that's going to kind of deal with Kohlberg and his theories. So the first stage is what we call the pre-conventional stage of morality. Children are only interested in securing their own benefit. And so to divide this a little further, he broke this down into some smaller stages. So stage 1 is known as egocentrism, pleasure, pain, profit orientation. And the reasoning or the way an individual would make their moral judgment is to think only of the reward or the punishment for their action. And there's no concern for other people. It's all a matter of, am I going to get caught? Am I going to get punished? And if I get punished, is it going to, how bad is it going to be? And that's how we make our decision to do right or to do wrong. And sometimes this happens with little kids. If I break the rule, will I get, put in the timeout, or will I be spanked? If that's the only reason, then that's kind of a shallower way of making your moral judgments. A little deeper is the second stage, known as the cost-benefit orientation or reciprocality, this idea of something being reciprocal. And this is a concern about reward and punishment, and they may seek personal gain by appealing to another person's self-interest. So you achieve or receive a reward or a mutual benefit. And kind of the cliche here is, I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back, kind of mentality. So if I'm going to get a little something out of it and you're going to get a little something out of it, then it must be good. Okay. The next phase is the conventional morality, and this is where our young person learns about rules and authority. And stage 3 under this is the good child orientation, and the concern is to seek social approval by keeping everyone happy. This is the person who's the pleaser, okay, and they're going to do whatever they can do to go out of their way to prove their loyalty or to prove their actions just to make a person happy. So decisions are based on personal relationships rather than the principle. It's all about trying to gain acceptance and to avoid disapproval of others, even if the action itself may not necessarily be solely good action. The fourth stage is the law and order orientation, maintaining social order. People, for the most part, will emphasize the different laws. So it's all about rules, policies. If you made a promise, that you back that up. The duty, the respect for authority. It's all about making sure that you're following the rules and avoiding the penalties. Okay. Moving from there, the next phase is the final phase, and probably the deeper phase, where we talk about the post-conventional stage of morality or principled morality. And children have learned that there's a difference between right and wrong from a moral perspective. And there are times that breaking a rule sometimes is the right thing to do. And, perhaps maybe by trial and error or observation learning, they have kind of made that decision. So stage 5 is about the social contract orientation. If you remember back to maybe sociology or maybe even when we talked about American government, social contract is usually things like a constitution and as such, but there is an emphasis on the idea of rules and laws that are flexible and can be changed by social consensus or by legislation. So it's very political in that regard. The emphasis is on fairness rather than on just plain old blind obedience. Okay, the idea is to promote the welfare, social welfare of others. So it's kind of like there's always a little bit of majority rule, but you also think about the minority and the consequences that the actions of the majority are going to have on the minority. And there's a flexibility there to protect the minority against the majority. The final one is stage 6, the ethical principle orientation. This bases decisions on universal principles of conscience that you'd apply to all people in all situations. So you're using a little bit of abstract and general principles. So, as far as an individual, the age that a person might be using this is probably gearing more towards our adolescents and to our young adults, opposed to our very young children because of the abstraction side of it. But this refers to the dignity and worth of each person rather than on just the plain old concrete rules. The key here is to make this work, it's got to be consistent with the principles to achieve justice. So individuals who have kind of done this, throughout history are guys like Jesus Christ, Mohandas Gandhi, or Martin Luther King Jr. For the most part, there's also consequences that are going to be faced. So if you're going to break a rule, a law that is unjust, are you willing to accept the punishments that go along with that and to be consistent with that? All right, moving onward. Culture and morality. Kohlberg, he believed that moral development follows the same development sequence elsewhere in the world, and individuals in the same stages in the same order in all cultures that are studied. So regardless of where you're at in the world, Turkey, Japan, Taiwan, Guatemala, US, you would follow all of those stages that we talked about in that order. Though there are criticisms to Kohlberg, and this is where the gender and morality kind of pops up here. One of Kohlberg's colleagues was a woman named Carol Gilligan, and she proposed criticism towards Kohlberg's theory. She argued that his theory had a male biasness to it and ignores uniquely feminine concepts of morality. Women, for the most part, morality is embedded in social relationships and in personal caring. It's kind of going back, if you remember in Chapter 8 when we talked about tend and befriend, there's a little bit of that takes place. And Kohlberg's theory, for the most part, maybe doesn't necessarily look at that and might not necessarily refer to maybe the actions of women as deeply moral. All right, thank you very much.